Thank you, Reverend Tom, and to everyone. I'm so pleased to be in this beautiful building, which Tom tells me was designed to look like palm fronds. And I don't know if it looks like palm fronds exactly, but it's beautiful. It's a lovely, lovely place. I'm so pleased to have been invited here by my old friend Ray, who was a good friend of my mother's. I grew up in Miami, and we're actually here to scatter my mother's ashes in Isla Morada tomorrow at her request. And I first met Ray when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And I recently did the math publicly and embarrassed myself because I said, Ray's 97, therefore I've known him for 89 years. I'm not a mathematician, but I've actually, no, I'm not 89 yet, so I can't have known him that. But anyway, I've known him for at least 50 years, and it's so great to see him. And I certainly wouldn't call myself his spiritual mentor, but he's been coming and sitting with my meditation group, which we have a drop-in group at, let's see, it would be 2 p.m. on Tuesdays, Eastern Time. And if it's a free drop-in meditation group on by Zoom, and anybody can come. And if you want to know how to find that, I'd love to see any of you. Please ask Ray about it. So I grew up in Miami. It's such a pleasure to be back. It's so beautiful here, and I forget how lovely it is here. It's so nice. It's funny, I heard Reverend Tom say, who's Sean Murphy? And who's Sean Murphy, or who's anybody, is actually a central question in Zen, because it has so much to do with the nature of identity and not having fixed identity. I think the best way to introduce what I'm going to do is to meditate together a little bit. It's funny because Buddhism is sometimes classed as one of the major world religions, but it's not really much of a religion because it doesn't deal with theism or the nature of God directly. So there's plenty of room for people from any kind of background. I serve on the board of a group called Spiritual Directors International, it's largely Christian actually, and in my Zen lineage we have Catholic priests, nuns, at least one rabbi who are all teachers, have become formalized as teachers. So when I was filling out the paperwork to become a member of the Board of Spiritual Directors International, it was one of the few times anymore that you get to ask, you get asked what your religion is. And when I was filling it in, I accidentally, instead of writing Buddhist, I wrote Buddhish. And I thought, you know what, that's pretty accurate. I think, I'm going to keep that because I feel Buddhish, more than fixed to a specific path or method of transformation and of connecting with what's spiritual in life. Before we start and have a few minutes of contemplation together, how many people have a contemplative practice? Meditation, yoga, tai chi, qigong, prayer, centering prayer. Yeah, a lot of you. Okay. One of the things I notice about people who practice meditation, who try to take on the practice of meditation, is that the method can seem rather mechanical. And it can seem like, okay, here I am following my breath or counting my breath or whatever method I'm using. And what does this have to do with experiencing? Well, I'll tell you the secret. In Zen Buddhism, we think of what is called God in other traditions as more of a force. We're very influenced by Taoism. When Buddhism went to China, it joined with Taoism. And so that's the Taoist view, is what we call the divine power is more like a flow than like a being. So that's definitely much the way I see it. It can, and of course we come to meditation or contemplative practice because we wish to connect with that, and often that can seem a long way away from when we're doing the practice. So we only have a little time to engage in practice together, but I would just like to say that what all the traditions of meditation through all the different religious paths and spiritual paths have in common is they all require centering in the present moment. And I teach university students meditation. I also teach meditation teachers. I teach people to lead meditation through my nonprofit Sage Institute. And I boil it down to that it's bringing our attention to the present moment, which is the only place where our life's actually happening, right? When I teach university students in a new semester, one of the first questions I ask is, which creatures on planet Earth live pretty much entirely in the present moment and therefore seem pretty satisfied with their lives when they're not actively suffering? And someone will say cats, and someone will say dogs, and someone will say squirrels, and somebody will say all of them, right? All creatures except really adult human beings know how to center themselves in the present. Well, they just mostly don't have any other option, right? We don't really know. It's possible that some of these palm trees that this roof was based on are out there thinking, what am I going to do next week? But probably not. So it's a simple thing. We're just returning to the present moment. And if we're not going to find the spiritual life in the present moment, where are we going to find it? We're never going to connect with it later. Or if we do connect with it later, it'll be now when we connect with it, right? One of those paradoxes. So I want to give a little guidance that helps us tune in for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll carry on talking about practice, resistance, and all the things we're supposed to talk about. So I'll begin just with the bell. So, in meditation, we often use the breath, although you can use any method you're accustomed to, because the breath's always coming and going in the present moment. It does have its own particular focusing and relaxing power, but primarily we use it because it's always happening. One thing many people don't recognize about meditation is that it's as much or even more a physical practice as it is a mental practice, because the only thing that takes us out of the present moment is our thinking mind. We think about past, we think about future, or we analyze the present moment. Oftentimes, judgmentally, we're wondering, am I doing it right? No, I'm doing it wrong. No, Ray does it right. Look at him. He looks enlightened. Okay, I'm never going to be like that. So, or I'm better than Ray. He's not sitting very well. So all these things that go through the mind, and they kind of trick us into pulling away from our direct experience. But the juice and the depth of our life, as well as the solution to many of the issues we face, especially when we don't know what to do, they arise best from centering ourselves in the present moment. There's nothing wrong with the thinking mind, it's just the wrong tool for meditation. So I encourage you to let your attention drop down into the body. You might use an image of if you tossed a flat rock into a swimming pool filled with jello. It would make its way down very gradually, in no particular hurry. And in just such a way our attention can drop out of our heads and down into our bodies and just find a natural place to settle. One of the things that often gets in the way of meditation practice, again, is that judgment. Am I doing it right? Or how long is this going on? Those sorts of things. One way to get around that is to just start with the exhale. Can we keep our attention steady from the beginning through the middle to the end of an exhale. And then we just release that effort until the next exhale. It's natural that thoughts and distractions come up. So if that happens, we just kind of give them a little nod, let them know they've been heard, and we return back to the next exhale. It's helpful to notice that the exhale is the relaxation pole of the breath. So body, mind, and emotions all have a natural tendency to relax during an exhale. If we notice that, appreciate it, and notice that it's pleasant, that will accentuate that effect and allow ourselves to deepen into that relaxation yet more. Also, we want to keep it from becoming mechanical by not only appreciating it, but raising a sense of interest or inquiry. We're interested in what we feel, observe about the breath. All the way through the exhale, feeling it in the body at a specific point. Each time we get to the exhale again, the relaxation can go a little deeper. When we feel centered, we can add in presence in the rest of the breath, but only once we feel solid and centered in the exhale. We might notice that the relaxation throughout each exhale is progressive. At the very end of the exhale, or in the turning point before the inhale, perhaps it's a brief pause, perhaps just a moment. But oftentimes there's a moment where everything seems to stop. We call that the still point. And if that should arise, we just allow ourselves to surrender to that stillness. Just gently see if we can stay there, even through the rest of the breath cycle. Has its own particular feeling of depth and focus, pleasantness, however you experience it. That will deepen if we can stay with it. So this feeling of stillness is vast, huge. It has no edges. It runs right into the next person's feeling of stillness. It's where we find our essential mind, or the Tao, or the mind of God, however we wish to think about it. But it's a feeling into it sort of experience. In a moment or two, I'll ring the bell and we'll ruin this lovely state by talking about it. Of course, I'm just joking. Talk has its own place. But stillness certainly has a place, and it has a place that we don't get to experience much in our society. And what we were here to talk about today is why we need this, especially if we're doing some kind of social action work. Or sometimes we feel like we'd like to do some kind of social action work, or we'd like to do something to serve, but we're just too busy, we just don't have a moment. Or when we engage in it, it's so discouraging and so difficult that it's very hard to feel like we're getting anywhere with it. So this returning to stillness is so important for nourishing the kind of work that we wish to do in the world. My big introduction to social action was in 1986 when I walked across the country with a group called the Great Peace March for Nuclear Disarmament. It was a group of 600 activists who walked from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in a cross-country demonstration that lasted 9 months for specifically for nuclear disarmament. It was quite a thing. It's very interesting to live in a tent city and move every day and walk 15, 16 miles a day. We covered more than 3,000 miles in 9 months. And the funny thing about this group of activists, I learned a lot about activists, and I'm sure you've seen this too. Here's a group of people who were supposedly together in this one united cause. But there was a subgroup out of the 600, which is a group of about 50 people who they all camped together in their tents, and they had their own little flag that they posted, and they called themselves the anarchist group. And any time that we had a city council that would make decisions for the Great Peace March community, which is it's a complex thing, 600 people moving every day, having to be fed and bathrooms and places to sleep and all of that. And anytime the greater body of the Great Peace March would make a decision, this group of who called themselves the anarchists, real anarchism as a political path, I have a lot of respect for, but these are just a bunch of people who like to call themselves that, right? And they would protest whatever the greater group of the march decided. So there was a movement at one point to make ID tags for people on the Great Peace March so that hangers-on couldn't just come without belonging there. And they showed up the next day with cut-out cardboard fake ID cards with their faces in it, and the rest of the cardboard over here, they said, my ID. But what it showed me is that their protesting was a habit. It was a stance. If anybody said yes, they were going to say no. And they were often very angry. And how many people have seen angry activists? Okay, it's a common thing. How many people have seen burned out activists or been one? Yeah. So these are the two big issues. And it can seem in a way selfish, perhaps, to to take that time to balance ourselves. But when we're acting, there's nothing wrong with feeling anger. I feel angry about the way things are going in this country, but meditation practice is a way to balance that so that we're not just inflicting anger, because when we inflict anger, the other side comes back with anger, and next thing you know, we're at war, right? So how many people have heard of the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh? He recently passed away. He's kind of a living saint. Yeah, most people have heard of him. I highly recommend any of his books. Being Peace is a really good one. He was a member of an order of monks that in the Vietnam War would go into bombed out areas, and they would help the people from both sides. Whoever needed help, they'd help, which means that both sides were against them, right? And he was eventually exiled. But I just want to share he was eventually exiled because he was working for peace in a time of war. And if you kept on like that, nobody was going to win, right? And isn't that the point, winning? So I had my first encounter with him when I attended a talk he was giving in California a couple decades ago. And it was the last event of a reconciliation retreat that he'd done between Vietnamese monks and nuns and veterans and American veterans of the Vietnamese War. And it was quite a thing to see because Thich Nhat Hanh came on stage and said a few words, and they had just finished a week-long retreat, and then the veterans and nuns and monks came out, and well, it wasn't long until they were all hugging each other and in tears. And his attitude, which is quite right, is that the American soldiers were victims of the war too. We know that now, don't we? Because so many of them have not done well since their return. They were permanently wounded themselves. I know a number of them oftentimes they show up in Buddhist practice. So I just want to read a few quotes, a few words by Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, "In the situation of war, one might be easily carried away by despair or anger. It doesn't have to be war. It can be the situation in this country now. I feel both things at times, right? But the key is carried away. Are we carried away, right?" He says, if you're caught by despair or anger, you lose the insight you need to bring people out of danger. In 1976, I went to the Gulf of Siam to help the boat people who were adrift at sea. We hired 3 ships to rescue them and take them to safe port. 700 people were on our ships adrift at sea when the Singapore authorities ordered me to leave the country and abandon all of them. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had to leave within 24 hours. I knew that if I could never find peace in that difficult moment, I would never find peace. So I practiced walking meditation all night in my small room. At 6 o'clock, as the sun rose, a solution came to me. If you panic, you will not know what to do. But by practicing breathing, meditation, and walking meditation, a solution may present itself. Some of us may have experienced that. We lie awake all night worrying about something with our minds, and we never get anywhere, right? And then we get up in the morning, we take a shower, and we're halfway through our shower, and a solution comes to us, right? Because our mind, we've dropped the thinking mind. So thinking mind's wonderful for certain things, sending people to the moon, but it's not very good for certain other things like reconciliation, peace, love, these things. I sometimes think, boy, Einstein was a genius. He discovered E equals MC squared, but when his wife was upset with him, did telling her E equals MC squared do him any good? Probably not, right? That's the analytic mind trying to solve these other issues, right? So, there's, in addition to Thich Nhat Hanh, There's actually the first American teacher in my Zen lineage. His name was Bernie Glassman. Has anyone heard of him? He's the founder of the Buddhist Peacemaker Order, also called the Zen Buddhist Peacemaker Order. And he, like I say, was one of the first Americans to receive authority to teach in this tradition. And he chose to literally take on the bodhisattva vow, which is taken every day of practice in Zen Buddhism and in other branches of Buddhism, which is to save or help all sentient beings, all beings. And oftentimes that's reduced to a spiritual principle, but especially in America, it's really been turned into direct action. Of course, these practices were developed starting 2,500 years ago, actually before then, when there was no democracy, people had no say over what was happening. If the next country wanted to invade you, you couldn't go out with picket signs, So things are quite different now. And social actions become a big concern in Buddhist practice. So just a few things that Bernie Glassman did. He started the Greystone Bakery. Some of you may have heard of it because they made Ben & Jerry's ice cream. If you've ever eaten Ben & Jerry's ice cream, that's who was making it. Well, Bernie, when he set out to do this, he was only going to hire homeless people. That's what he did. He hired homeless people. The homeless people needed a place to live, so then he acquired once they were making money from the Greystone Bakery, and you can imagine Ben & Jerry's, we've probably all paid money for it. They had money coming in. We didn't know it was being made by homeless people, but it was. And as well as many other baked goods. And so they needed housing, so he bought an apartment building for them. Then they needed childcare, so he got a childcare center going. Then some of them were sick, so he developed an AIDS support center. And on and on. Even though Bernie passed away a couple of years ago, his work still goes on. The Zen Peacemaker Order still exists, and the Greystone Bakery still goes on, and the whole Greystone constellation. It's been very successful with getting people off the street. Of course, not every homeless person turns out to be a good Ben & Jerry's. What's their cookie dough maker? Yeah, but I think that's their flavor. But many of them do. All they need is the opportunity. And Greystone Bakery, excuse me, still hires anyone who applies. Isn't that kind of amazing? No interview process. You apply, you're hired. He's also done reconciliation gatherings at Auschwitz between Holocaust survivors and children of Holocaust survivors and children of soldiers and camp guards and SS officers, similar to what Thich Nhat Hanh did with the Vietnamese monks and nuns and former soldiers. You may have heard in the news that there was a gathering in the Black Hills of the Lakota Sioux where one of the descendants of Custer, is it George Armstrong Custer? Am I getting his name right? Anyway, you know Custer's Last Stand. One of the descendants of Custer fell to his knees in front of one of the Lakota chiefs and begged forgiveness and was given forgiveness for his grandfather or great-grandfathers. That was quite in the news. Bernie Glassman arranged that reconciliation meeting. He also did one in Rwanda. Can you imagine that? So there's a lot of possibility about combining these two things, and it's my conviction that we need it, because otherwise we're just not going to last. I've seen it so often. Currently, my work is with books, it's with training people to meditate, it's with training people to train other people to meditate. So I'm fortunate it's just built into my profession. But I've got a great personal interest in social action and supporting those who do social action so they can continue on to do it. One of the core principles of the Buddhist way of looking at social action is, well, We have a fire here. If my right hand was in the fire, wouldn't my left hand just pluck it out? It wouldn't think, I don't have time to pluck that right hand out. You know, I'm too busy, I'm in a hurry. That's the attitude that when we practice that still point enough, replenishes us enough and opens us enough that we start to see the commonality. We hear a lot of talk about oneness, but unless we're actually feeling it, we won't usually act on it. A complete feeling of oneness is like that. It's like the right hand plucking the left out of the fire. Of course, we have to be smart about it. Compassion isn't always, it's not always nicey nice, you know. We don't necessarily want to invite that relative of ours who's a drug addict in to sleep on our couch when we've got toddlers at home. He's never going to leave, right? So somehow we have to be tougher about the compassion than that. But engaging in practice, it gives us that strength to continue. It gives us the strength to know what to do with our anger. It gives us the strength to know what to do with our fear. It gives us the strength to know what to do with our despair. It puts us in balance so we can handle those things without ruining our life, because there's no point in that either. If we ruin our life and fall into despair. Simone Weil, some of you know the philosopher, was engaged deeply in social action, and she became so concerned about the plight of people who didn't have enough to eat in the post-war years in Europe, post-World War II, that she starved herself to death. What's the point? Then she can't help, right? You know, she couldn't bear to eat while others were hungry. So somehow we have to balance ourselves and our care for the world and our care for others. And I encourage us to really dig into our contemplative practice and find a way to go deeper than just the mechanical, because I know the mechanical can get tired. So there's a great depth if you can find that still place and stay with it. And I guess we're about out of time. We're going to be staying for lunch. My wife, Tanya, also just graduated from Richard Rohr's Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation. Some of you may know Richard Rohr's work. He's a Franciscan priest who, for some reason, has not been excommunicated, has a huge following and alternative contemplative and social action approaches in his Catholic tradition. So Tanya's put a lot of thought into this too, and she'll be at lunch too. So we'll both be happy to talk to you all further about this. Thank you very much. Yeah.